Elizabeth? Yeah, okay.
And the turkey vultures are gathering in Port Hope because the salmon are dying in the river. So
Yes.
anytime you will probably see lots of turkey vultures around town these days.
Yeah,
Elizabeth,
Is that the mare? Is that the mare, or is that the actual bird?
No, it's the turkey vultures that are sitting up on the top of the water tower on Dorset Street West. They're often
okay.
lots of them.
if everybody gets a chance to, anybody gets a chance to go to Port Hope. I was there the other day and the Ganaraska River was really rushing through Port Hope. So I know some of you, the folks that live in Port Hope would know that, but others, it's quite a spectacular sight.
Well, after, 10 millimeters of rain and actually almost 10 inches of rain. Tom, you had a lot of rain up at your place.
We had about 4.5 inches.
Yeah.
We had about 3.5.
20 millimeters.
No wonder the whole township wasn't washed out into the lake. But,
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Tim, it's your turn to present our featured speaker for tonight. Tim?
Thanks, Frank. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Doug Tozer. Doug is Director of Waterbirds and Wetlands at Birds Canada in Port Rowan and Ontario. He did his understudy at the University of Guelph and went to grad school at Trinity University at Peterborough, Ontario. At Birds Canada, he leads the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program, the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, and the Long Point Waterfowl and Wetlands Research Program. Doug's going to speak to us tonight about the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey. What does 40 years of monitoring tell us about the common loon productivity? Without further ado, I turn it over to Doug. Doug, let's go.
Okay, thank you very much. Here, I'll just get my slideshow up here.
Babies.
I have a new version of PowerPoint here, and I can't see the, anybody know the keyboard shortcut to get your slide to come up? Was it F5 or something? I just need to hit something. Maybe it's this thing. Here we go. Okay, there we go. You have to know that technical difficulties follow me around all the time on giving presentations. So I can't give a talk without having some kind of hitch. So that's good. Okay, so here we go. The Canadian Lakes Loon Survey. What does 40 years of monitoring tell us about productivity? And I'll just jump right in here. I'd like to start with some context. The common loon has been a symbol of untouched wilderness and healthy environments for some time. Just take here, for instance, Ontario Nature, who you all be very familiar with. They adopted the species as their logo over 30 years ago in 1988, symbolizing, of course, their commitment to preserving healthy, untouched environments. And, many others have followed suit. And have recognized the power of this symbol by incorporating the common loon into their logos. There's dozens, perhaps hundreds of examples, such as the ones you see here. I mean, you can just go on Google and type in common loon logo, and you can scroll through like literally hundreds of things like this. It's really quite impressive that the species has such an effect. Even the Minnesota State Lottery, of all things, was moved enough by the common loon to adopt it as their logo. A lucky sign, perhaps. Maybe we should all buy tickets. Just kidding, of course. So, obviously, there's something very special about loons, and some of us were talking about that earlier before the meeting started. There's something very special about loons that strike a chord with just about everyone. Indeed, the following quote by Arthur Cleveland Bent, who of course was a famous North American ornithologist, active in the early 1900s. This quote really gets at the heart of it. Who has ever paddled a canoe or cast a fly or pitched a tent in the North Woods and has not stopped to listen to this wail of the wilderness? And get this last part, this is probably the most important part. And what would the wilderness be without it? So, there it is. Even as early as 1919, people considered the common loon as being representative of untouched wilderness and by extension, the state of the environment.
Yeah.
So, the fact that so many people associate common loons with untouched wilderness alone makes the species a really good choice as a symbol of the health of the environment. But as we shall see during the course of this talk, this cherished indicator and symbol of healthy environments, and it's potentially in trouble. And remarkably, it's because of the amazing efforts of hundreds of Canadian Lakes Loon Survey volunteers that we even know of the broad scale of the problem across southern Canada. So here's what I'd like to cover. First, some background on the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, just to further set the stage. Then I'll summarize results from the program from across southern Canada since the early 1990s, and from Ontario since the early 1980s, because the program started in Ontario first as the Ontario Lakes Loon Survey, and then it spread across Canada later in the 90s. And after we've done that, then we'll look at what those results have to tell us about changes in the number of chicks that adults raise to independence. And then we'll look at what might be causing those changes, which is really what we're interested in right now. And at the end, I'll attempt to pull everything together into some sort of meaningful conclusion. Now, before we do all that, I'd just like to take a little bit of time and very briefly describe what Birds Canada is all about. I know many, perhaps even all of you, will be familiar with us, but if not, this will convey who we are and what we do. And it'll also better explain where tonight's presentation is coming from. So in a nutshell, Birds Canada, we're the #1 go-to organization for anything to do with bird monitoring and conservation in Canada. We're a national, charitable, non-government organization, but we work very closely with all levels of government. This is our national headquarters that you see here at the base of Long Point on Lake Erie in Ontario, just outside of Port Rowan, but we also have staff in various places right across the country. So what we do on any particular day to carry out our mission falls into these 3 broad categories that you see here: citizen science, education, and research and conservation. So our education programs, they target schools and youth groups and urban groups. And our research and conservation programs strive to answer current questions of conservation interest via targeted field research. We often collaborate with universities and supervise graduate students, for example, to carry that kind of stuff out. But it's really citizen science that we're best known for. And we have nearly 40 citizen science programs operating now, 1 operating in each province and territory across the country. Remarkably, we have over 60,000 people participate annually in our programs. And as many of you will know, because you probably participate in some or multiple of our programs, and thank you very much for that. As many of you will know, the way these programs work is that we train members of the public to conduct standardized bird surveys in the field. And then we put the information they collect to good work to advance bird conservation. And today's presentation will, of course, focus on just one of our citizen science programs, which is, of course, the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey. So the main reason for starting the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey back in 1981 in Ontario was to assess the long-term health of common loons and the lakes they depend on in relation to the negative effects of acid rain, which of course was one of the really big environmental concerns and stories at the time. Now, this is still one of the main purposes of the survey, but it's grown and evolved to include monitoring in relation to an ever-changing suite of additional threats, especially now climate change. The purpose of the program also includes strong contributions to loon and lake conservation, particularly private stewardship, and increase public awareness of the importance of loons and the healthy lakes that they depend on. So the way things work, participants select lakes of their choice to survey. They make a minimum of 3 visits each year to each lake, although most of our participants often go much more than 3 times. Sometimes up to 30 visits per summer, especially if they live on the lake or have a cottage on the lake. And those 3 minimum visits are to determine the number of territorial pairs with the first visit, determine the number of hatchlings per pair with the second visit, and the number of 6-week-old chicks or large young per pair with the final visit. And this last one, the number of 6-week-old young per pair per year, that's what we refer to as productivity. It's the number of large young and the number of 6-week-old young that each pair is producing each year on average. And you're going to hear that term quite a bit throughout the talk, productivity. So that's a good one to know. And of course, we focus on 6-week-old young, like the one you see here next to its parent, because once they reach this size, they're about 2/3 the size, at least, of an adult when they're 6 weeks old. Once they're that big, they're much less likely to be eaten by predators. And in turn, they're much more likely to survive to adulthood. So you get a really good measure of how many of these chicks will make it into the next generation with some, reasonably good probability of surviving till then. So over the decades, the survey has documented productivity of common loons on 4,500 lakes across southern Canada in at least 1 year. That's what you see here with the black dots. And on some of these lakes, there's over 30 years of consecutive data for some of these lakes, really quite remarkable. The survey gathers productivity information on hundreds of common loon pairs each year, over 1,100 pairs on 700 different lakes at the maximum, as you can see by the peaks in the lines on the graph on the left. And many of these are in Ontario, as you can see by the top red line in the graph on the right. Our sample sizes are much smaller in the other provinces, you can see there on the right. So, nearly 4,000 participants, amazing to think that there's been this many, but of course it has been several decades. Nearly 4,000 volunteer participants to date have collected this wonderful data set. So ultimately what we have is a huge amount of productivity information from across much of the common loon's breeding range in southern Canada. I think if you go into the database now, there's something shy of 35,000 breeding attempts or something crazy like that. Just a wonderful data set to have such large sample sizes to work with, especially if you're into statistics and running numbers. Those of us who are number geeks like that get really excited about having sample sizes like that. So what then does it tell us, this wonderful data set? What does it tell us about changes in productivity and what might be causing those changes? Well, at the broadest scale, the survey shows that common loon productivity has significantly declined across southern Canada at a rate of about -1.4% per year since the early 1990s. You can see that here, the red line through the dots, it just sort of goes sort of over time, it just gets lower and lower as it goes from left to right. There's some variability there, it bounces around a little bit, but it was high on the left and it gets lower and lower as it goes across to the right. And this works out to a reduction of about 20% over the entire period. So at the beginning of the period, or on the left of the graph, loons were on average producing about 0.7 6-week-old young per pair per year. And this has fallen down to about 0.55 in recent years. And I know it sounds a bit funny, producing or reporting part of a chick per year, like 0.55. But this makes sense because some pairs don't nest at all some years, some territorial pairs don't nest, and others do, but they don't produce any chicks. So the average works out to less than 1 chick when you average it out across many, many different pairs like we have here. Okay, so at finer spatial scales, like if you look at particular provinces or groups of provinces like we have here, the trends in productivity vary a little bit. So the decline in productivity is steepest on the prairies and in the Atlantic provinces, shown here in red, at -2.3 and -3.6% per year, respectively, since the early 1990s. And productivity also declines, but a little less steeply in British Columbia since the early 1990s, and in Ontario since the early 1980s, which is shown here in orange at -1.4 and -1.1% per year, respectively, in British Columbia and Ontario. And in Quebec, there's no evidence of a long-term decline since the early 1990s, although productivity does decrease in more recent years. So overall, we can take these data to tell us that they tell us common loon productivity is significantly decreasing across most of southern Canada since the early 1990s. And it's very much worth noting that the rate of decline in common loon productivity found by Canadian Lakes Loon Survey citizen scientists throughout Ontario, which is shown here to the right of the map, it's identical to the rate of decline found in the only other published study to date on the topic, which was done in and around a single county in adjacent northern Wisconsin, which is shown to the left of the map on this slide. So the location of the observations made by citizen scientists in Ontario are shown by the many orange dots on the map, whereas the location of the Wisconsin study is shown by that orange square over there in Wisconsin. And the Wisconsin study was based on intensive monitoring of uniquely color marked individuals by an army of trained technicians. You'll notice the colored leg bands on the loon in the picture on the left. A lot of folks don't realize this, and when I first got into studying loons, I was blown away by this, but you can put colored leg bands on loons, and eventually they pull their leg out and stick their leg up high on the water, and you can read the bands. Most loon researchers say you don't have to wait more than about 15 or 20 minutes for them to stick their leg out and you can see the bands. So this is just like banded Canada jays in Algonquin Park. You can tell who is who. So you got this Wisconsin study with this, incredibly detailed, individual specific information by trained technicians, where, as we have unmarked, we obviously don't ban birds as part of the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, and we've got citizen scientists, but you've got exactly the same decline in those two studies. The Wisconsin study is minus 1.1% per year, and so is the citizen science study, the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey data. So I really think, the similarity, well, the exact same rates of decline between the two studies, I think it's a real feather in the hats, so to speak, of our Canadian Lakes Loon Survey volunteers, showing the reliability of their carefully collected and hard-earned data. Because I think that the study in Wisconsin is really sort of a confirming example that we're on the right track and we're accurate and not biased by what we're collecting in Ontario with the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey. Okay, so common loon productivity, we can be pretty sure here it's declined across most of southern Canada and at least in part of northern Wisconsin over the past several decades. So the big question, of course, then is, why might this be? What is the driver or drivers behind all these disappearing loon babies? Well, luckily for us, Rob Alvo, a longtime loon researcher based out of Ottawa, he came to us a few years ago wishing to collaborate on his decades-long study on loons in relation to acid rain around Sudbury, Ontario. And after a search for funding, we gladly accepted. And to our group, we added the very capable and highly productive Kristen Bianchini, who made the project her postdoc, as well as Mark Mallory at Acadia University in Nova Scotia and Satendra Bhavsar with the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. And these last two, Mark and Satendra, they're both really well known in acid rain, mercury fish, and loon research. And I was just sort of along as a bit of a ringleader of sorts. And ultimately, this very fruitful team, boosted by Kristen's remarkable analytical speed and skill, produced 3 peer-reviewed scientific publications in quick succession, like you see here. And they all aim, at least in part, to help identify the driver or drivers behind the productivity declines. And they form the backbone for much of the content of the recent Canadian Lakes Loon Survey 40-year report that we just released at the end of the summer. So what we'll do next is look at more closely at what these papers, as well as the report shown here, and the many decades of Canadian Lakes Loon Survey data, what they can teach us about the declines in productivity. So, as expected, the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey offered a rich and extensive data set for asking a large number of questions related to productivity. We used 38 years of loon monitoring data from over 1,500 lakes in Ontario, and amazingly 65% of those lakes were monitored for multiple years, some consecutively each year for over a decade. And to our pile of loon data, we added several factors that we thought might be causing the declines, each gleaned from various other broad-scale monitoring programs. Some of them government run and some citizen science. And we focused on Ontario rather than using the Canada-wide data set because it was here that we could find the most data for factors that might be driving the declines. So ultimately, we considered the influence of over a dozen factors and their interactions with each other on common loon productivity. So the factors included lake area, longitude, pH of lake water, which of course is a measure of acidity, fish mercury contamination, shoreline development, boating activity, bald eagle occurrence, and double-crested cormorant occurrence, as well as a number of weather variables, including average maximum temperature and average precipitation in April, May, and June, and precipitation in the coldest quarter of the year. Now, only a small handful of the lakes had information for all of these many different factors. So we used a creative approach to work our way through the data in a way that maximized as much information for each of the factors as possible. And here's what we found. In the top left graph, productivity declined since 1981. We already saw that a few slides back, so that's not a huge surprise. This has occurred, as we saw, at a rate of minus 1.1% per year, which of course equates to a total reduction of about 30% over that entire period. Then in the top right graph, productivity increased with increasing lake area. That's a relationship that's been shown by others with several different data sets, many different times. So in a nutshell, bigger's better in terms of lake size if you're a breeding common loon. And in the bottom two graphs, there's an effect of longitude, so east to west, west to east, however you want to think of it, including an interaction with year, such that productivity was lower in the northwestern part of the Ontario study area than in the southeastern part. And productivity declined more steeply over the years in the northwestern part than in the southeastern part. And we wonder if these effects of longitude might be linked to underlying northwest to southeast differences in bedrock and maybe land cover, or could be other differences across the study area from northwest to southeast. Surprisingly, in a way, we found no difference on loon productivity in relation to shoreline development, shown in the graph on the left, or in relation to boating activity, shown in the graph on the right, as estimated by our volunteer participants. And this is in contrast to some other studies, which have found that productivity decreases as these two factors increase. Now, maybe our measure of these factors are not accurately capturing the effects, or maybe they capture them just fine, but the effects are weak on average across our large study region, much of which has low human population density, because we certainly do know, and many of you on the call tonight may be able to personally attest to this, we do know that shoreline development and boating activity do negatively influence common loon productivity on certain particular lakes, just not on average across the large data set that we used in this study. And we found an effect on loon productivity of the presence of both bald eagles and double-crested cormorants, as measured by eBird Canada data, one of our other citizen science programs that many of you will be familiar with and probably contribute to, so thank you for that. But not in the negative way that some expect, given that bald eagles are predators of loons, and cormorants, of course, may compete with loons for fish because they're big fish eaters. So in the top right graph, the presence of bald eagles was associated with higher, not lower, loon productivity. So in other words, where there were more eagles, the loons produced more chicks. And in the lower left graph, the decline in loon productivity was less steep, not more steep, in the presence of double-crested cormorants. In other words, the productivity decreased faster where there were fewer cormorants. So we suspect that what this means is that breeding loons, eagles, and cormorants, they all prefer and do better on average on larger lakes where there's more fish. Big lakes have more fish than small lakes. So they probably all just do better there. But this may not be as strong an effect for loons on lakes with especially high eagle densities. Everything may fall apart there, of course, due to predation of loons by eagles. And this occurs on some lakes where the loons don't do so well because of the eagle predation. But again, on average across a big sample of lakes, loons and eagles and cormorants don't seem to be a big part of the story. Okay, loon productivity we found increased with increasing April temperatures. So low productivity in cool springs. And this may be linked to higher abundance and longevity of loon blackflies, which cause nest abandonment. So some of these loon-specific blackflies can be seen swarming all over the incubating loon's head in the photo. And it's amazing, these loon blackflies, they don't bite anything except common loons. They're specific just to common loons. And so if there's enough of them and they're annoying enough, they can drive incubating loons right off their nests. I've seen videos of this where there's way more than what you see on the loon's head in this photograph. And the loon, it just leaves and dives in the water. Or alternatively, loon product or low productivity in cool springs might be linked to prolonged ice cover and associated low oxygen levels that causes, that in turn causes fish kills. And of course, then there'd be lower food available for loons, although the influence of ice cover on fish survival is extremely complex and it's really hard to generalize. Or both could be at play, the ice cover and the loon blackflies. Either way, they don't do as well when there's a cool spring. They do better when it's warmer early in the spring in April. Okay, productivity was very strongly influenced by lake pH or acidity. In the left graph, loon productivity significantly increased with increasing pH, which of course is decreasing acidity. This gets so complicated, right? Because remember, pH values mean, high pH values mean low acidity, and low pH values mean high acidity. So there's no big surprise here. It's a very well-established relationship. Acid's bad, so to speak, if you're breeding common loon. The more acidic the lake, the fewer the chicks. But in the right graph, for the first time with this data set, we're now seeing significantly steeper declines in productivity over time on more acidic lakes, as shown by the red dashed line falling quicker over time than the blue line above it. And this relationship is something that McNichol et al. Identified as early as 1995 using the same data set in the paper shown at the bottom right. And at the time, the relationship was not statistically significant, but it certainly is now with our analysis. So in other words, acid's bad and productivity on more acidic lakes is apparently getting even worse if you're breeding common loon. Okay, and lastly, we found that loon productivity decreased with increasing yellow perch mercury contamination. So the relationship, it's not especially strong, but it is important to note that the yellow perch mercury data available to us, it was averaged across many different lakes within secondary watersheds. And it was also averaged across years within each decade. So not exactly accurate or precise for predicting loon productivity on a particular lake in a particular year when you're averaging across many different lakes and across a whole decade. But it's still remarkable, I think, that it still produced the relationship, even with those coarse data. So I think this suggests that the relationship might have been much tighter and stronger if we had had yellow perch mercury data for each lake in each year. But of course, we didn't have that available to us. And of course, we chose to focus on yellow perch rather than other species of fish because yellow perch are a favored and very important forage fish for loons. Okay. So I know that was a lot of graphs and a lot of sort of hardcore results all at once. But, so where does this leave us, right? So to return to our original question, what is the driver or drivers behind all these disappearing loon babies? Well, our study, it doesn't point us convincingly to one smoking gun or a set of smoking guns, so to speak. But it does give us ideas worthy of further consideration. So we can probably safely conclude, based on our results, that declining loon productivity in Ontario, at least, and probably elsewhere across southern Canada too, it's probably not being caused in a big way by shoreline development, by boating activity, by bald eagles, or by double-crested cormorants. And we realize our measures of each of these 4 factors that may not be ideal. They could be better. But nonetheless, it seems appropriate to put these 4 factors in the background, at least for now. We think that there's more merit in a hypothesis that involves lake pH or acidity and fish mercury contamination with connections to climate change. As we know from other research, mercury is a potent neurotoxin, and when it gets into breeding loons, they get lethargic and they don't work as hard to produce and protect their chicks. As one loon researcher put it, when you have loons with a lot of mercury in them, they just become bad parents. They spend less time defending territories, studies have shown, less time incubating their eggs and less time feeding their chicks. As well, it's been shown that chicks with higher levels of mercury, they take fewer energy-saving rides on the backs of their adults. Some of you will know that really young loon chicks, up till 2.5 weeks of age, they crawl onto their parents' backs, probably to get warm while they're out on the water. They don't do that as much when they have a lot of mercury in them. Chicks also have weaker immune systems, and they're worse at evading predators when they have a lot of mercury in them. So this all means that productivity is lower for breeding loons with lots of mercury in their bodies. So our hypothesis works like this, and we won't get into too much detail here because, trust me, this can get really complicated really quickly because it involves a lot of complicated water chemistry. At least I find it a lot complicated. So it goes something like this. Emissions to the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels over the years have polluted many lakes by increasing their acidity through acid rain and by depositing mercury. And because every time you burn fossil fuels, you get the bad components of acid rain and mercury going up into the air, into the atmosphere, and eventually it falls out in precipitation and gets down into a lake directly, or it falls on the land adjacent to a lake, and then it gets it flows down into the lake with runoff. So more mercury moves into food chains and up to loons on more acidic lakes due to the activity of acid-loving bacteria that initiate the whole process. And there's a whole lot packed into that sentence, but essentially the bacteria that cause the mercury to get into a form that makes it go up the food chain, that happens a lot more with in acidic areas. So due to various chemical pathways, these same acid-loving bacteria have probably been getting more active and more abundant over the years due to increasing water temperatures and increasing frequent droughts and floods as a result of climate heating. And there's a lot of, there's various different pathways involved there, but basically you heat up the water and you have more drought and flood events due to increasingly unstable water levels that you get with climate change. That all in various ways encourages or increases the activity of these acid-loving bacteria, and that may be why we're seeing the steeper declines in productivity on the acidic lakes as opposed to not. So we have some support for this hypothesis, which comes from recent evidence from throughout Ontario, like you see here, which suggests that mercury contamination has increased in predatory fish since the mid-1990s due to concurrent changes in weather and climate. And these increases in fish mercury contamination, which presumably also occurred in loons, although we can't be sure, roughly coincide with the decline in common loon productivity we have identified, and of course they could be related. As well, we also have some support for this hypothesis that comes from recent data from Wisconsin. And in this study, climate variables caused fluctuating water levels that resulted in increased mercury contamination in both fish and loons, similar to the effect that occurs in newly flooded reservoirs. When you flood an area, you often get a spike in the mercury contamination. So you can even experimentally do this. You can flood a place and up the mercury just through that fluctuation in the water levels. And there may very well be other climate-driven mechanisms that are increasing mercury contamination in fish and in turn in loons over time that have yet to be described and understood, because as I've been alluding to all along, the chemical pathways through which mercury moves through the environment and then gets into food chains and goes up through fish to loons. There's many different ways that can happen, and there are dozens of factors, both biotic and abiotic factors that influence which of those pathways are active and how active they are. So it's a real mess for analysis because there's a lot of factors and a lot of confounding factors. But it does look like this may be what's going on. So we've dubbed this set of ideas the acid mercury climate hypothesis. And we realized there may be other factors causing declines in common loon productivity. And we realized that the most influential factors may vary within and across regions. I mean, you know, that's to be expected. Anything that involves so many different factors in ecology like this is bound to be messy and vary across, you know, the distribution of something so widely scattered as breeding common loons that are all across southern Canada. So whether all of the ideas embedded in this hypothesis line up, and whether the effect of the proposed mechanisms are strong enough to influence loon productivity in the ways we're actually observing, all remain to be seen. You know, perhaps it should only be the acid climate hypothesis, or maybe it should just be the climate hypothesis. But we think these ideas in general warrant, you know, further scrutiny and testing. And I think that they may play an important role in explaining, at least in part, in what's behind the declines. Okay, so if you'd like more information on what we've covered here today, then please, of course, look up the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey 40-year report, which is freely available to everyone on our website, which is at the bottom left there under the picture on the left, birdscanada.org/loons. It's a fairly easy URL to remember, birdscanada.org/loons. And for the more technically savvy among you, I encourage you to read our 3 recent peer-reviewed scientific papers if you'd like. And if you can't get a hold of them, but you would like to read them, please get in touch with me directly at dtozer, D-T-O-Z-E-R, at birdscanada.org. And if you'd like to find out more about the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, or if you'd like to join the Loon Survey, then again, please go to birdscanada.org/loons. You'll find everything you're after at that spot. Okay, so now as if that's not enough to whet your appetite for more information, here's yet another excellent source for further reading that I'd like to tell you about. This past summer, James Pruck, a longtime loon researcher and world authority on loons, released this book, Loon Lessons, Uncommon Encounters with the Great Northern Diver. This book is really a great, engaging, and entertaining read, and it describes firsthand many of the exciting scientific discoveries made in loon research over the past several decades, including some of the ones that we've talked about here tonight. It's especially notable for presenting new information on why common loons are the way they are and why they behave the way they do. And it also includes loads of information on recent discoveries on their wintering grounds. And these topics, they're really not covered in such an accessible way in any other source, I'd say. I have really enjoyed the book when I read it as soon as it came out. So I highly recommend it if you're looking for a nice recent overview of all the really interesting things that have been discovered in the last couple decades on loons. Okay. So I'd like to end by pointing out that, you know, we're really fortunate for the dedication of the many supporters of the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, without which we'd be unaware of the declines in loon productivity across most of southern Canada. When you think about bird monitoring and you think about most of the 40 citizen science programs, bird monitoring programs that we have at Birds Canada, almost all of them, in contrast to the Loon Survey, they count numbers of breeding birds or adult birds that are out there. It's very unusual that you get a program that monitors productivity, that tells you how many chicks are being produced by the population. And in the case of loons, I think this is really important and may turn out to be very useful for conserving them, because we're finding out about the problem earlier, much earlier than we would have otherwise. I mean, loons are really long-lived in the wild. We know from the study in Wisconsin, which has been going on for several decades now, 100 different lakes in that one county and areas adjacent to it, all banded so they know who's who from year to year. That study has shown that they often live more than 20 years in the wild. It's regular for loons to do that. So you can imagine if you live that long quite regularly, you can have this reduction in productivity like we've documented, but it may take quite a while, years, in fact, in sort of a lag time, before you actually see reductions in the number of adults or the number of nesting pairs out there. And I think that's what's going on. In that study in Wisconsin, where they know every single loon pair and exactly where they are from year to year, they, like I pointed out in the talk, they've seen the same rate of decline in the production of chicks like we have in Ontario with the Loon Survey, but they have not seen a reduction at all in the number of nesting pairs. That has not gone down. It probably will very soon. On the graph here, that horizontal dashed blue line that's down there at the 0.48 line, that's an estimate based on a sort of complicated population model of the number of chicks that need to be produced by a loon population so the numbers don't decline, so the number of territorial pairs don't decline. And you can see we're not quite there yet, but we might get there if it keeps trending downwards. So my whole point is we're really quite, we should really be grateful to the efforts of so many volunteers who have, alerted us to this problem, because without it, if we only had information on the number of nesting pairs out there, we wouldn't know there was a problem yet. And we wouldn't find out about it and see it until the numbers started to drop. And that would, the problem's going to be way worse and much harder, presumably, to deal with by the time that happens. So anyway, a real feather in the hats of our volunteers for alerting us to this. So as a next step, we'll be working with other loon researchers throughout North America to collectively figure out what's behind these productivity declines and to figure out, what's best to promote to mitigate it, or hopefully even reverse the declines. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. And of course, many thanks to the different organizations shown here that support our loon monitoring research and conservation, and especially to the many people who donate directly to the program as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug. Anybody have any questions? Unmute if you have a question. Otherwise, you can't hear you.
I have a question. Doug, is there any way that you might find out what the historical numbers of loons might have been in Canada?
Good question.
Before acid rain and all that came in?
I mean, we know from some of the early writings of, early ornithologists in the province that, they were a lot more common in the south, nesting probably even on the North Shore Lake Ontario and even the North Shore Lake Erie, where they've disappeared from. But as far as like what the density might have been, say in Algonquin Park, 200 years ago, hard to know if it would be much different than maybe it is now. I mean, it seems like there's loons almost everywhere that they could be still. It's just that, like I say, they're presumably producing fewer chicks. Another thing, I know this isn't quite necessarily related to your question, but it made me think of it, and I just wanted to mention it. In the study in Wisconsin, they showed that the number of young loons that don't have a territory yet. Remember, the way it works is loon is hatched, it heads south in its first fall, it goes to the wintering grounds, and it spends 3 years on the wintering grounds. It doesn't even come back in the summer. On average, at age 3, they come back to the breeding grounds in Ontario, for example, and they shop around trying to find a breeding territory. And it takes them up to age 6 on average before they actually get a territory. So you have this population of sort of, they call them floaters. They float around looking for a breeding territory, but they don't have one yet. And of course, because all the loons are banded, the Wisconsin study is able to estimate the number of floaters as well. And there's been a 50% reduction in the floaters. Half of them are gone. And of course, I think that I think is my point, that there's this lag time before this reduction in chicks moves through the age groups and eventually will result in a reduction in the number of nesting pairs. So you can sort of imagine it like a big boulder, big bowling ball rolling through the population, and eventually it will start to chip away at the other age groups as it goes down the line.
Doug, I have a question. This study has quite a long timeline, and over that period, there's probably been a change in the emissions of industry over those years, hopefully for the better. You know, the elimination of coal generation in Ontario, some of the pulp and paper, and some of the stack technologies and treatments. Would you hopefully expect maybe there'd be a lag recovery in the loons in the next coming years because of that, or?
Well, really good point. I mean, and this is, I'm glad you brought this up, because I don't explain this very well in the talk, and it's a really important point. We've done a good job of reducing emissions of the harmful components of acid rain and mercury out of our fossil fuel emissions. That's been, take Sudbury, the smelters at Sudbury, one of the world's biggest producers of acid pollution in the world in the 1970s, reduced by 90%, right? Like, you can't do much better than that. Well, yeah, you can go to 0%, but, and same for mercury. There's the Minamata Convention. We have an international convention that we've all signed on to reduce mercury, blah, blah, blah. The point is, we've done a good job. There's less of this stuff going up into the atmosphere. So why is it that it's getting worse, right? Well, I think there's two reasons. With the acid, those lakes were many of the lakes in northeastern North America especially were so damaged by acid rain that they haven't recovered. Like, you look at the pH of those lakes over the years, and they might go up a wee little bit by like a couple of decimal points, but it's still way down low. And I think it's just because so much of the calcium and the other neutralizing components of those lakes were eliminated by the acid. Like, the water chemists tell us it'll take hundreds of years for those to ever get back to where they were before the acid damage. So you've still got these really acid lakes, in a lot of places. And then the thing, acid rain still, the effects of acid rain are still there on a lot of lakes, even though there's much less of it falling out of the sky. And it's the same kind of thing with mercury. I mean, we pumped all this mercury out into the atmosphere for decades, and it's out there and you can't get it back, right? In the literature, they call it legacy mercury. And the thing with mercury is it's incredibly stable. Like, it just sits there. Elemental mercury, it just sits there in sediments and in the forest floor until it gets washed down into the lake. And the thing I was talking about, those acid-loving bacteria that start the process of moving the mercury up the food chain. Well, part of the complex chemistry is that in order for the plain old elemental mercury, in order for it to go up the food chain, it has to be methylated. It has to be converted into methyl mercury. And once it's methyl mercury, then up it goes into food chains. Good old regular elemental mercury can't move up food chains for chemical reasons that I don't really fully understand. I just know it has to get methylated. And so that shows you that, you know, if you have something that comes along that ups your methylation, it doesn't matter if there's nothing coming down out of the sky in terms of mercury, because you've got all this legacy mercury. And if you're methylating more of it over time, more of it's going to go up the food chain, and you're going to see it in loons. And of course, that thing, I think, is the climate change. I think it's the increasing of water temperatures, which has been shown now to be a global thing across inland lakes across the world. You know, that water temperatures are going up. And we all know we have increasingly extreme precipitation events and droughts going back and forth. And we know that through a bunch of complex ways causes more methylation and more mercury. So I think that's a long convoluted way to say that you can have less and less of this stuff falling out of the sky, but you can still have more and more of it going up the food chain.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Sherilyn here. I don't know why my camera's not on, but I didn't turn it off on purpose. Doug, just wondering, you know, in the migration, where do they end up, and what would the mortality rate be down where they spend the winter, and also in transit? And are they ever banded to see what their mortality rate might be in transit?
Excellent question. So we have a fairly decent idea of what the migratory pathways are now for the main regions of the loon breeding population. We know that through a couple of different ways. The nice thing about loons is they're really big and heavy, so you can put a satellite transmitter on them. The sort of the rule of thumb in the research world is whatever you put on a bird, it can't exceed 3% of its weight. And if you keep under that 3% of its weight, then it's, you know, it doesn't have a significant negative impact on its survivorship. So this has been done with loons by folks in Michigan and Wisconsin. And I think there's a USGS website where you can even go on and look at automated tracks of satellite transmitted loons and watch them, you know, how by date throughout the year where they go. It's fascinating to watch. Like, you know, the little dot will be there and it's on its breeding lake, you know, all summer. And then all of a sudden in October, it zooms from northern Wisconsin and stages on Lake Michigan for a little while, and then down to Florida it goes, and then it's in the Gulf of Mexico. So we know from that they can shoot from the lower Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic coast off, say, South Carolina or Georgia. They can do that in 3 or 4 days, pretty easy. And so the other way that we know about the how the populations divide up is through molecular work now. Blood samples from loons all across the breeding range, as well as from birds that are caught on the wintering grounds. And through a bunch of molecular hocus pocus that I don't really understand, you can tell who came from where. And so there's a really nice paper that just came out a couple months ago that shows sort of, you know, the birds from southern Quebec go down here and the birds from Alberta go down here in the winter, that kind of thing. So that's all figured out through satellite transmitters and the molecular work. And you're asked about survivorship once they get down onto the wintering grounds. I don't have a number off the top of my head, but I mean, it's year to year survivorship in adult loons is really high. I mean, if you're going to live 20 to 30 years, which they do quite often, you got a really good chance of surviving till the next year. Unlike, you know, say the robin in your front yard that probably has a 50-50 chance of making it to its next birthday. But on the wintering grounds, and like I said, Jim Peruch's book really he's done a lot of research on them in the Gulf, especially in relation to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. There's a lot of things that can go wrong on the wintering grounds too. They're really susceptible to oil spills. And I think loons we're just starting to learn what they eat when they're on the wintering ground. And remember, they're in salt water in the winter, right? Loons have a salt gland just like a seabird does, and they can eat, marine fish in salt water and ocean water for months on end in the winter. And we're just sort of learning, what fish species they're going after and all this kind of stuff. And, with climate change and, pollution and these oil spills and who knows what else, all those, the fish that they may support them, or those fish communities are changing, and we don't really know if there's suitable alternatives for them to eat. In some cases, some of these big changes may have a positive effect. Like, I know I'm jumping around a little bit here, and I'm going to go back up towards the breeding grounds on the lower Great Lakes. But when loons stage on the lower Great Lakes and Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, like when they're going south in their fall migration, they're eating round gobies like crazy. And if you're not familiar, round gobies are a non-native invasive fish that's been introduced to the Great Lakes from Europe, Asia. And loons they're eating a lot of them. So there's a really bad change in one way that may actually produce a lot or supply a lot of food for them when they're staging. Now it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because there's lots of them for them to eat, which is a positive, but the gobies may also be a pathway to transmit type B botulism to loons, which is a big mortality factor in some falls on the Great Lakes. Sometimes there's, like tens of thousands of loons that die due to type B botulism. But it's highly variable. Then the next year you hardly have any, because it all depends on the planets sort of have to align, so to speak, to have the right factors to have a big botulism outbreak. But when it happens, it can be really big. And that's another thing that's happened in since about 2000, there's been somewhat regular type B botulism outbreaks on the lower Great Lakes. And how that works into all of this is an interesting question that many of us have thought long and hard about. One way that it might work is that, if there's a lot of loons being killed during the fall in a botulism outbreak, that obviously means those birds aren't returning to their breeding territories the following spring. And we know that younger loons produce fewer chicks than older loons. It looks like you have to get a little bit of experience to be good at it. And so if you have a lot of the older birds dying off as they're heading south, and you have more of the 3-year-olds coming north and replacing them or whatever, that could be contributing to the declines in productivity through a type B botulism mechanism, I suppose. Anyway.
Oh,
sorry, hopefully that kind of answers your question.
It does, yes, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a quick question. Thank you so much, Doug. It's so interesting because we have so many loons on the lake here. And first of all, Elizabeth, I have to apologize. I said it was a trumpeter and they were mute. We only had 2 trumpeters in the spring. So very briefly, as opposed to the mutes that have been here. Sorry, I digress. So I'm just wondering that these people who are observing the 6-week chicks, I don't understand how they can even find the nests, because we are on the lake all the time and I have yet to figure out where they're nesting.
Yeah, a lot of our volunteers don't end up finding the nests. They see the pair, they don't know where they're nesting, but then they see them hopefully they see them with chicks later. And so it doesn't, like the whole protocol doesn't necessarily require them to find the nest, which is a good thing, because as you point out, like some loon nests are real easy to see and find, and some of them are really difficult. So sometimes they find the nest and sometimes they don't, but because we're focusing on all we really need to know is that there was a pair there, and then have them go back later in the summer to see if they have chicks or not. And if they do have, how many, and do they make it through to the 6-week stage?
And I'm just wondering, they had an article in the Globe the other week about how COVID has had a beneficial effect on the numbers of birds. And I'm wondering if, when you go back and study your numbers, if you're going to see that for
really interesting question. Maybe, who knows? Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways that COVID could manifest itself. I know that, a lot of people were fishing and spending time on the lake because it was an activity you could do without interacting with other bubbles. So maybe that upped the disturbance. I don't know, who knows? There could be a lot of different ways, but it's a really good question.
Any other questions?
I have one more question, Doug. It was a great talk. Really enjoyed it. Given all you've learned from this, looking at the data over the last few decades, do you have any plans to, now you have this hypothesis, to have any focused or targeted studies to try and get more verification of it, whether maybe some I guess some subsamples, a selection of certain lakes where you have some really good volunteers that can carry it out? Is there any consideration to that, doing that?
Absolutely, really good point. And I should have mentioned this too. Yeah, so one of the immediate next steps we're going to take is we're going to collaborate with some of the loon researchers in the northeastern US in Maine, who the Biodiversity Research Institute, they are sort of the keepers of all the mercury loon data from across North America. Dave Evers there has been the leader of all that stuff. And we're going to collaborate with Dave. And the mercury data, it's been collected in certain years in certain places, and it's all over the place. But we're going to bring it all together and to one data set. And it should give us a pretty good set of numbers to be able to more finely test the acid mercury climate hypothesis in a more finely tuned way. And I think that'll be important because, as I sort of alluded to, like, we think it's a good hypothesis, but it could be totally wrong. When we have these better data, we may test it and find out that we can cross it off our list too, which is just, in some ways, that's just as important as finding out it's true. As it is to say, okay, it's not that, we have to go on to something else. So we're hoping that we'll be able to do that analysis sometime over this coming winter. So that's an immediate first step. The other thing we've done is, luckily, the loon research world in North America is a really tightly knit group. There's something called NELSWIG for short, which is the Northeastern Loon Study Working Group. Every year we get together and discuss things. And we've formed a subgroup underneath that NELSWIG umbrella, and we're going to meet sometime in the next month for the first time. And so we've brought together sort of, the best loon researchers in North America. And the task of the group is, okay, what are the other hypotheses? So we got the acid mercury climate idea. What else is on the table that makes sense? And, we're going to form that list, and we will do exactly what you've suggested, which is, okay, let's start raising money and finding ways to test each one of them and cross them off until we figure out what it is. And then we'll try and figure out what it is we need to do to, mitigate it or reverse it. And luckily we have all the people in one place now. We just have to bring them together and see what we come up with. So I'm excited about that. Walter Piper, who is the gentleman who's been leading that study in Wisconsin since the early 1990s, he and I are going to chair this group and co-chair it, and we'll see where that goes. So yeah, wheels are turning. And Walter is also now the new director of the Loon whatever it is center in Minnesota. It's just been started. I can't remember the exact name of it, but if you Google Loon Center Minnesota, you can find this online. So through that, I think what we might end up doing to test some of these ideas is what you suggested, where we may try to replicate what Walter has done there in northern Wisconsin. So we may start banding populations of loons in a few different places elsewhere in North America, strategically selected to test whatever the new hypotheses are that the group comes up with.
Well, I appreciate the challenges you face. It reminds me of some years ago when I was still in the working world. We supported some research by Peter Dillon at Trent, and Sean Watmog was one of his people. They did a lot of work on acid impacts on catchment basins and trying to look at the mobility of those contaminants through the soils and that. And it was all I remember at this point now of how complex it is. So you've got a really complicated thing to try and deal with, as you mentioned earlier. So it's
Yeah,
great
it's
though.
so complicated. It's such a good point. In some ways it's daunting because there's so many different factors and it becomes so difficult to tease one of them out and get good test results. But in some ways it makes it kind of fun in some ways too, because ecology, it's such a big challenge trying to figure it out because there's so many factors. So.
Anybody?
I have a question.
Mhm.
Is anyone looking at other loon populations in the north and the west or in Europe? Do we know what's happening with them?
Yeah, really good question. Yellow-billed loons, another species up on the tundra, and there's some long-term studies on it in Alaska where so there's some numbers from there. They don't seem to be, the numbers don't seem to be plummeting too much like they are in the common loon world. For the other loon species, we don't really have good information, like red-throated loon, Pacific loon, Arctic loon across the top of the old world. We don't know as much about what's going on. Those ones are trickier, of course, because they're nowhere near where there are very many people, where they breed at least. So that's there's something where Christmas bird count data can come in handy, and eBird, because then at least you get an index of abundance when those loons are in the south where there are people, so to speak, so you can get a handle on it that way. But we know that those numbers can be coarse and not as sensitive to detecting subtle drops in numbers, so it gets kind of tricky. But I would say those other species are just much less well known as to what's going on compared to what we've got going with common loons, for sure. Yeah.
Any other questions? Nope. Doesn't look like it. Anyway, Doug, thank you very, very much. That was fascinating.
You're very welcome. It was great. And thank you for having me, and great to have so many excellent questions. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Maybe we'll get you back again to carry on.
Sure.
Thanks, Doug, very much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Frank, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tim, and especially thank you, Doug Tozer. That was an extremely interesting talk you gave tonight. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Before closing, let me announce our next featured speaker for Friday, October 29th, 2021. Speaker will be Samantha Knight, speaking on monarch butterflies, a tale of milkweed, migration, and management strategies. So I hope you all enjoyed this evening, and we'll see you next month. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye.